Good evening. We're going to continue our conversation this evening to look at this very important theme, the theme of militant Islam or radical Islam, and what is this phenomenon that, and how are we as Christians to engage with this. This is something that we want to really seek to understand and how to best engage or respond to it. And so it's a very difficult topic to address because of all the politics around it, but I will try my best to cover it, and hopefully we will have some helpful insights that we can engage with in our Q&A session. And I'm going to leave some time for questions and answers for us to be able to look at it. So, who are these? Who are they? Who are the militants that we're talking about? Where do they come from? Who are they? I just want to let you know briefly that it used to be said that the militants are from an uneducated, very poor, deprived economically background. Not quite. Not quite. All the data we have shows that they come from an educated, kind of middle to upper class sections of Muslim society, and that some of them, the leadership in particular, are well educated and financially, economically well off in many ways. So they are not from that kind of class that we are always made to believe. And they always enjoy a kind of overt or covert kind of support from the established either religious leadership or political leadership. So this is the kind of, they start off with some kind of either active or tacit support. They grow, and sometimes they even draw their finances and their abilities from the government or from some religious groups, the leadership. That's not because they start as militants, but they start as something else, and then they grow into militancy. But sometimes they start off as militants, like in Pakistan, where the Pakistani government will turn a blind eye to militant groups, actually to breed militant groups to use them against India, for instance. And our own governments have done that in the past by supporting militant groups in Afghanistan, which turned out to become Al-Qaeda at the time, using them against the Soviet Union. So we've had those kinds of situations that they get some support from either the state or established religious and other leading Muslim or non-Muslim groups. They are mainly Sunni, which means in Islam we've got the two big sects, Sunni and Shia. The militants today that we're talking about are mainly Sunni. Sunni Muslims make up about 90% of the world Muslim population. Shia is about only 10%. So they're mainly Sunni. And they are tapping into the sense of humiliation and a sense of siege that is in the Muslim world. About Muslim world are feeling that kind of sense of siege that the West, America in particular, is overwhelming them with its culture and the economic dominance and the political dominance of the West makes the Muslim world feel under siege. And this sense of humiliation because, again, the caliphate, the Muslim caliphate was abolished in 1924 by the Ottomans after the First World War. So all of that has made some Muslims feel a sense of humiliation, that they really feel like, why are we in this situation? This was made worse in 1967 after the Arab-Israeli conflict, when the Muslim armies were beaten very badly. Again, it sent that kind of sense of humiliation to the Arab Muslim world. In a culture where honor is very huge, you can understand the impact that this has had on society. And so that is coming from that kind of a sense that was there, especially from the second half of the last century. This is a quote I took from ISIS magazine. When ISIS started its campaign in 2014, it came out with a magazine. And the magazine, this is the quote I took from the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. And you can see from the quote that sense of we want to restore the dignity and the honor of the Muslim nation. All Muslims everywhere, glad tidings to you and expect good. Raise your head high, for today, by Allah's grace, you have a state and Khalifa, which will retain your dignity, might, rights, and leadership. It is a state where the Arab and non-Arab, the white man and the black man, the Easterner and Westerner are all brothers. Soon, by Allah's permission, a day will come when the Muslims will walk everywhere as a master, having honor, being revered, with his head raised high and his dignity preserved. This kind of sense that we are coming to restore that kind of dignity and honor back to the Muslim community, the Muslim world. Very, very clear sense of we are humiliated, but we're going to fight back, take our honor back. And when the word Khalifa, again, the Caliphate, very, very important. That is the Islamic Empire, which was abolished. So they are restoring the Caliphate back in its place. And that if you see the first magazine that ISIS came out with, the cover page had the Caliphate. The Caliphate was the cover headline for the Caliphate has been restored. So it's that kind of sense of political humiliation that they want to address. But what are the Quranic bases? Because the groups like ISIS, they quote the Quran very, very profusely. If you read their magazines, they quote the Quran, they quote traditions, they quote Islamic sources. So yes, there are some Quranic bases. But what are they that they are quoting? There's this particular text, which is very, very much quoted by ISIS in its magazine when it talks about its militancy. Let those who fight in the cause of Allah, who sell the life of this world for the hereafter. To him who fighteth in the cause of Allah, whether he is slain or gets victory, soon shall we give him a reward of great value. A promise of a reward. You fight in the cause of Allah, you get a reward. And why should he not fight in the cause of Allah and of those who, being weak, are ill-treated and oppressed? Men, women, and children whose cry is, O Lord, our Lord, rescue us from this town, whose people are oppressors. Again, the sense of we have to liberate other Muslims. We have to liberate Muslims under oppression. And so that sense of obligation to go to Chechnya, to go to Bosnia, to go to Afghanistan, to go to Syria, to fight and liberate Muslims who are under oppression. And raise for us from thee one who will protect, and raise for us from thee one who will help. Those who believe fight in the cause of Allah, and those who reject faith fight in the cause of evil. So fight ye against the friends of Satan. Again, this kind of idea that we are fighting on behalf of God, and the enemy is fighting on behalf of Satan. So there's a struggle between evil and good, between God and Satan here. That is how they will take these texts very literally from the Quran. And that's how they apply them. So they are fighting for a reward. They are fighting as freedom fighters, as liberators, but they are also fighting on behalf of God. They are fighting on behalf of good. They are fighting against evil, against Satan. So that is the kind of mindset that you get. There are other Quranic texts that they cite, but this one is the main one that they cite a lot. There are quite a number of texts like that in the Quran that you will find groups like ISIS citing to justify their actions. There is public support for this around the Muslim world, and it may surprise us, but there is some support. In 2013, the Pew Research Center poll asked Muslims around the world whether attacks on civilians were justified. This was a question, whether attacks on civilians were justified. Globally, 72% of Muslims said violence against civilians is never justified. 72% said never justified. And in the US, 81% of Muslims oppose such violence. In the US, Muslims, 81% said no. Under no circumstance is violence against civilians justified. But about 14% of Muslims in the nations surveyed and 8% of Muslims in the US said violence against civilians is often or sometimes justified. 14% of 1.6 billion is still a huge number. And 8% is a small number, but it's still a considerable minority that people in the intelligence services take notice of, and they are concerned that if people who think this way and can justify it, then they are much more likely to even perpetrate these acts themselves. So there is some kind of public support, but the overwhelming majority of Muslims are opposed to the use of violence, especially against civilians. And the statistics make it that very, very clear. So what is causing the problem? Where is the problem coming from? And there are some views about what is the cause of these problems. Some will argue that the cause is primarily theological. In other words, Islam is the cause. The Quran is the cause. Muhammad is the cause. Islamic history. Some would say it's Islamic history. That's where the problem is coming from. Now, I understand where this is coming from, but I have problems with that, because if Islam is the cause, if Islam is the problem, or the Quran is the problem, my question is, what is the solution? What do we do? Should we ban Islam? Should we gather all the Qurans and bomb fire it? What is the solution? There's no solution out of that. And so those who say Islam is a problem, I think, don't offer us any solution. And to be honest, those kinds of analysis are problematic also. So I don't kind of tend to agree with problematizing Islam or problematizing Muhammad or the Quran, because it just leads us nowhere. Because not every Muslim does that. The Kurdish Muslims who are fighting in Iraq, being killed by ISIS, they read the same Quran. They recite the same Quran. If the Quran is a problem, we have 1.6 billion Muslims. So all of them are potential suicide bombers. Then we are in big trouble, if that's the case. But it's obviously not the case. So the Quran cannot be the problem, or Islam cannot necessarily be the problem. The other view is that it has nothing to do with Islam. It has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with politics. It has everything to do. It's that what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal. Religion is just used as a cover. So that's the other view, that nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with Islam. Again, I think that is also too simplistic and too general. Islam definitely has some challenges. It has something to do with Islam, Islamic history, Islamic theology, Islamic scriptures. It has something to do with Islamic traditions. But Islam is not the problem. The other view, of course, that is also very common in the Muslim world, is that ISIS and Boko Haram are American or Israeli creation. You talk to Muslims in the Arab world, and they will tell you, we don't know where ISIS comes from. The CIA created it. The CIA, you go to Nigeria, and there are Muslims who believe Boko Haram was created by the CIA to tarnish the image of Islam. So you have these conspiracy theorists. You see, I went to shopping in Atlanta a couple of years ago for a car, and then I met this sales guy, very articulate, intelligent Jordanian, young Jordanian, and he took me on a drive. And as we went to drive the car, he started talking to me about religion. And then we got talking about religion, and I asked him about what is happening in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And he said, oh, ISIS, America created it. America. And I'm like, what? And this is a young guy, well-educated, articulate, in Atlanta. And he believes that. So you can imagine what is happening in the Muslim world. So there's that kind of sense of denial also. It has nothing to do with us. So these views, I have always said, the truth is always in between all of these, somewhere between there. And the truth is that neither of these satisfactorily explains the problem. All of them have something to do with what is happening, and more. but none of them explains the truth fully, the situation fully. So what are we supposed to do? This is something that a good friend of mine has talked about, that as Christians, we need to be careful when we begin to talk about radical Islam, because radical Islam has a power to radicalize Christians. This is what he's saying, that it used to be commonly said that Islam was Satan's greatest masterpiece. I believe that is not true. I believe that Satan's greatest masterpiece was the Crusades. Why? Is it because the Crusades were the worst atrocity that ever happened in history? I think Hitler was worse. Stalin was worse. Pol Pot was worse. What is so horrible about the Crusades is that it was done under the symbol of the cross, that Satan succeeded in distorting the very heart of the Christian faith. Satan succeeded in taking the very heart of the Christian faith and turning it around to mean not just something different, but to mean something completely opposite of what it's supposed to mean. He's talking about the betrayal of the Christian faith here. That this is what militant radical Islam can do to Christians. It can lead you to become radicalized yourself. It can lead you to become militant yourself. And he said, let's beware. Let's guard against that. Let's learn from history. And as Christians, as we hear about this, the other day I mentioned here, that Christians are becoming so full of fear and so full of hatred and so becoming so radical themselves because of radical Islam. And we don't want to get back there. That's what Joseph Cameron is cautioning us. Beware of the radicalizing effect of radical Islam on Christian communities. You go to Nigeria, you go to Kenya, you go to different parts of the Muslim world, and you find Christians are also under that kind of pressure. What do we do when we are attacked every day? So we have to arm ourselves, we have to protect ourselves. Some will argue. And that leads to radicalizing, that leads to very belligerent theology also coming out from these kind of contexts and justifying violence in the name of Christian theology and Christian biblical exegesis. So you find that, and we need to be careful as Christians about the radicalizing effect of radical Islam. Understanding ISIS, this is, Kamel Dawood is a Muslim scholar from France. He wrote a very, very important piece on ISIS. And he's trying to explain the phenomenon ISIS and the motivations behind it and the causes for ISIS. And that's what he says. He says that ISIS is first and foremost a culture, not a militia. It is first and foremost a culture. How do you prevent future generations from turning to jihadism when the influence of Fatwa Valley and its clerics and its culture and its immense editorial industry remains intact? ISIS is a culture, not a militia. You can't just deal with it militarily. You've got to deal with it culturally, ideologically, intellectually. That's what he's saying. And he's pointing to Saudi Arabia. He's pointing to the clerics, the clerical establishments, elite of Saudi Arabia. And he's saying that the ideology, the teaching of Saudi Wahhabi Islam, that is where this culture is brewed from and exported to different parts of the world. So it's first and foremost a culture. And we need to tackle that. You can defeat it militarily. But if you do that, and you leave this intact, he's saying that you've not done much. He goes on to say that in the Arab world, they call ISIS Daesh. So he talks about black Daesh, white Daesh. And he's still talking about Saudi Arabia. Black Daesh, white Daesh. The former slits throats, kills, stones, cuts off hands, destroys humanity's common heritage, and despises archaeology, women, and non-Muslims. The latter is better dressed and neater, but does the same things. The Islamic State, Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of execution going on in Saudi Arabia on a daily basis in this brutal form of beheadings. And he's saying that Saudi Arabia does it. ISIS is doing it. One is just neater dressed than the other, but they're doing the same things. And he's saying that these are the things that we have to address, that we cannot shy away from addressing these issues from the Saudi perspective also. Because Saudi teachings is a fundamental part of the problem. And he makes the point again about other contributory factors. He says Daesh has a mother, the invasion of Iraq, but it also has a father. Daesh has a mother and a father. And he goes on to talk about, again, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and its religious industrial complex. Until that point is understood, battles may be won, but the war will be lost. Jihadists will be killed, only to be reborn again in future generations and raised on the same books. He said to understand ISIS, you've got to understand the culture. You've got to understand the religious establishment from which this is coming. But he's saying that more than that, we've got to understand the role of Western American foreign policies also in this whole situation. But for the invasion of Iraq, there will be no Daesh today, he will argue. That ISIS emerged out of that vacuum. So that we have to learn from our mistakes, from the missteps that we take. Because Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but now you've kicked him out and you have a murderous group that is rampaging the whole area now. So he's saying that there is a cause, and the cause is not just Saudi Arabia alone, but the geopolitical factors also that play into that. So that we need to understand that Islam is not the only cause of the problem. The Quran is not the only cause of the problem. That there are political factors. There are other factors that play a role into this whole situation that we find ourselves in. So, what do we do with this culture? And how do we understand this culture that we're talking about? This is what is happening, and there's hope as far as I'm concerned. That this culture that we're talking about is changing in very minimal, modest forms. It's changing. And that's the good news. Iran is a clear, typical example of how things are changing and moving forward. This is, again, an article that was written in the Economist magazine in 2014 about Iran. And it talks about Iran, that the transformation of Shia Islam into an ideology undermined both the state and the mosque. The great irony of the Islamic Revolution is that inadvertently it did more to secularize the country than the tyrannical Shia who ruled Iran after a coup in 1953 and persecuted clerics. By forcing religion on people, it poisoned worship for many. By forcing religion on people, the Iranian Revolution poisoned worship for many. A lot of young Iranians are turning away from Islam. They don't go to the mosque. They don't say their prayers any longer. They're just becoming secularized. They've given up. And they are giving up in increasing numbers. And that is the point that he is making here. That when you force religion on people, that is the backlash you get. In Egypt, it's the other way around. In other Muslim countries, when you suppress it violently, then you give it much more oxygen. And when you force it down the throats of people too, then you get this kind of situation. So Iran is a clear example of things changing there. And the Iranian youth are the most educated in the Muslim world today. And they are not going to look backwards. They are looking forward. They are moving past this clerical theocracy that has dominated Iranian life. Even in Saudi Arabia, there are changes happening there. Even in Saudi Arabia, we just talked about. The ruling and political class leans towards reform. If you look at the political and the ruling class, especially the younger ones, they are leaning towards reform. They want change in society. They are coming under the pressure of diplomatic pressure, political pressure now, and the criticism is growing louder and louder of Saudi Islam. And they are hearing it, and they are taking steps. They want to address it, you see. But they are facing up with the religious clerical class, which is still very conservative and still holds sway very much on the population. So you have a kind of a very mild tension brewing in Saudi Arabia between the ruling class and the religious class. And that is an interesting kind of dynamic there that we don't know how it's going to play out in the future. But the Saudi ruling class is now mostly turning a blind eye to things that they saw would have been very difficult to even say or do a few years ago. They are turning a blind eye. They are now allowing some kind of dissent. They are allowing some kind of critique. There are now popular comedies in Saudi Arabia that is critiquing the religious, social norms of Saudi Arabian life. And therefore, it is beginning to allow those kinds of things. Takes the form of humor to criticize and to challenge and to question some of the things that is happening in the country. The religious class is not happy about it, and they are pushing back on it. Just last year, women had the chance to vote in Saudi Arabia for the first time. And women even ran for offices in local elections. So again, very modest changes there happening in Saudi Arabia. You see, if you go to Saudi Arabia today, I was just telling Chris over dinner that you will come across religious, well-to Saudi people, generally are very wealthy in many parts. Not that there's no poverty there, but you will come across the clerical class with driving some of the latest BMWs, using some of the latest gadgets, smartphones, and yet their mindsets is still very much rural, 17th, 18th century kind of mindset of religion. And that is the contradiction you have there. And the ruling class, which is much more open, is where you find, because the ruling classes, they tend to send their younger ones to study in the West, and so they come back with Western education, with some kind of influences, and begin to push for changes. The hope in Saudi Arabia also is the education of women. In my recent reading of Saudi Arabia, more than 50% of university graduates are girls. More than 50%. So there's hope there. When you get the girls educated, there is hope there. Because these young ones, these young women who are very articulate, very smart, they study, they are not going to come back and allow you to tell them that they cannot have their own ID, that you have to put their ID, their names on the passport of their cousins, male cousins, to be their guardians. So there's going to be a change with time. And that's where there's hope. I did mention the other day about this gathering in Morocco, a gathering of over 250 Muslim scholars and leaders. And they came up with what they call the Marrakesh Declaration. It took place this year, beginning of this year. If you Google it, you will find the details of the document. A very, very powerful document issued by Muslims. They gathered. The king of Morocco invited them to discuss the issues in the Muslim world today and to come up with suggestions. And some of the things they came out in that document saying was, they urged we urge Muslim educational institutions and authorities to conduct a courageous review of educational curricula that addresses honestly and effectively any material that instigates aggression and extremism, leads to war and chaos, and results in the destruction of our shared societies. Address educational curricula. This is an admission that we have a problem in our universities. We have a problem in our educational institutions, because that is where we inadvertently impart on young people, on young minds, these kinds of extremist views. And the scholars are saying that we've got to address that. We've got to revise these books. Kamel Dawood was saying that unless you address the books, the teaching where it is, unless you address that, you kill militants and militants will be born. And you had this gathering and they are talking about addressing those books. For me, there's hope. This is new language. That Muslims, because from my own experience, I have been very frustrated because of the denials in the Muslim world. Many at times, they are just in denial. This has nothing to do with us. We have no problem. The problem is all caused by America. It's all caused by Israel. That has been very frustrating. Now they are setting up to say, we have a problem. We've got to address the problem. And I think that's very hopeful. That is very hopeful. It goes on, the document goes on to call upon representatives of the various religions, sects, and denominations to confront all forms of religious bigotry, vilification, and denigration of what people hold sacred, as well as all speech that promotes hatred and bigotry. Again, condemning these things and saying that we've got to address these things. Egypt is a very strong American ally. You go to Egypt, you put on the television, the radio, the newspapers, just a few years ago, and it was all attacks on Christianity and on the Christians, the Christian minority, and they had literally no air to breathe. You see, vilification of Christians and Christianity. They are now saying, we've got to address those. We've got to stop it because it's not helpful. So there are very hopeful signs there that there is a wind of change, a lot of introspection happening in the Muslim world. And I think that that is, for me, a very good thing. So, what do we as Christians make of this? And how do we respond, as I said earlier, apart from avoiding the radicalization and being mindful of that? This is what Miroslav Volf says. Miroslav Volf makes the point that there is no claim in Islam that God justifies the ungodly, and no command to love one's enemies. This is not a part of Islamic teaching. Love your enemy is not part of Islamic teaching. He said, but these are the signature claims of the Christian faith. Take the redemption of the ungodly and the love of enemy out of the Christian faith, and you unchristian it. You unchristian it. If we take this out, if we take the love of enemy and the redemption of the ungodly out, we unchristian it. So what he's saying is that we've got to respond to this, but we have to be careful that we don't throw away our signature claims. What makes Christianity unique? What sets Christian faith apart? And what he is suggesting here is that love of enemy is one of the claims that only Christianity can say. We believe in this. We teach this. And we cannot afford to throw it away. And so what is he saying here? It's not to say that let's go look for ISIS and cuddle them and hug them. No. But what he's saying is that we cannot demonize all Muslims. We cannot do that. We cannot allow fear and hatred to consume us against all Muslims. We cannot do that. Because when we do that, we are not only doing emotional damage to ourselves, we are doing damage to our Christian faith and our Christian witness. We cannot do that. And I talk about using superior weapons. We are clearly in a battle. We are clearly in a struggle here with militancy, be it militant Islam or whatever, fundamentalism. We are clearly having some kind of battle going on and a struggle going on. So what do we do as Christians? And we cannot use the same weapons as the enemy uses. We cannot afford to do that. This is our own Martin Luther King. That's what he had to say about about violence. He said, through violence you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. We cannot meet hate with hate, hatred with hatred, because it doesn't work out. And so we need to find ways of effectively dealing with this. And the only way to counter the terrorist fear and hatred that they are facing, that they are espousing and propagating, is to meet it with a show of welcome and love to ordinary Muslims in our midst. That is the way that we fight the terrorists, to isolate them. Because they are telling ordinary Muslims, you are hated. People don't like you. Americans don't like Islam. Americans hate Muslims. That is the conspiracy. And so if we fall into that, we simply feed into that also. And we need to be careful that we don't really help them sell their gospel, if you like. And this is what Desmond Tutu said after post-apartheid South Africa. He was talking to black people, and he said to black people, look, be kind to white people. The racists amongst them need you to rediscover their own humanity. He was telling black people, you can't afford to hate white people because of apartheid, because of the attitude and the actions of the racists. You can't afford to do that. He said, when people do that to you, when people treat you horribly, it's because they have lost their own humanity. When people dehumanize and demonize others, it's because they have lost their own humanity. You need to help them to rediscover their own humanity. And I think that some of these radical groups, they've lost all sense of hope. And for them, the only hope left is to die and go to what they think is paradise for them. We cannot afford to demonize and depersonalize Muslim groups so that we can be able to get even with them. We can't do that. We need to help people to rediscover their own humanity. And finally, this is a quote that I've taken from Gospel of Matthew about Jesus talking to the disciples when the enemies came to attack Jesus with swords, with clubs. And the disciple pulled out a sword to cut off the ear of one of the attackers. Jesus ordered and commanded him, put your sword back in this place. For those who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? If I want to fight them, I can do that. I've got the resources. But I'm not going to fight them with the same weapons. I'm going to use superior weapons. I'm not going to use guns because the enemy is using guns. I'm going to use better weapons than them. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do. We are in a struggle. We have to be smart. We have to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves and use better weapons than the enemy. Because that is the only way that we can win. And I hope that we will all wise up like serpents and be gentle with the spirit of the gospel of peace that Christ has left with us. God bless you all. Amen.